and I'm excited to be here with another program and history speaker series in partnership with the Camden-Rockport Historical Society. And now I'll turn it over to Jan Kelty of the Camden-Rockport Historical Society to introduce our speaker.
Thank you for coming out tonight. Not a very nice night. And appreciate all the people on Zoom who decided to stay home. But to hear our third speaker for the winter series, Charles Lagerbom, Maine's marine historian. This is sponsored by the Camden-Rockport Historical Society. And I would like to thank the Camden Public Library for partnering with us for location. Now it's been a really great cooperative situation. We revived the speaker series, which kind of got scuttled with COVID, and then didn't get revived for a while. So I had the pleasure of going out to a number of other venues. Actually, particularly the Sail, Power, and Steam Museum in Rockland, and heard a number of speakers and had the opportunity to take their hand and say, "Would you like to come to Camden?" So that's been a great opportunity, and I've filled the series up immediately. If you enjoy this, and I know you will, I've heard Chip speak before. This free talk, we would really appreciate it if you gave us a small donation for the Historical Society. We've had ship dives, and we've had to take a really deep dive into our endowment in order to maintain our aging buildings down at the homestead and the museum. And so we can use all the help we can get on those. Chip has received his Master of Arts degree in History and Archaeology from Maine. And he has organized surveys of ship remains in Maine waters. And I'll let him explain some of that to you, maybe if he has time. The 1779 Penobscot Expedition, which I don't know anything about, and a 17th century English galleon, Angel Gabriel, that went down off of Pemaquid. He's done field work in Antarctica and authored Whaling in Maine and Maine to Cape Horn, the most dangerous journey, which I had the pleasure of. That's what you did last year, right, down in Rockland. And whoa, what a story that was about going around Cape Horn. And he writes a column called Half Seas Over for Village Soup, I believe. Yeah. He also teaches AP History in Belfast, the high school, New England Maritime History, and co-teaches Marine Studies class at the Belfast Marine Institute. So please help me welcome Charles Chip Lagerbom.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming out tonight. When I was asked to give a talk about the Maine, I thought, you know, it's a very interesting ship. And everybody remembers the phrase, remember the Maine. But what do we really know about the ship? Or what happened to it, what happened afterwards, and so forth. So I want to take you down memory lane here. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll be able, if somebody says, hey, remember the Maine, you'll be able to say, yeah, and I know this about it, and I know this, and so forth. So that's kind of my goal here tonight. If you have questions anytime through here, just raise your hand and get my attention. I just love talking about ships and maritime history. And Maine is such a great place in order to, kind of scratch that itch of mine. So remember the Maine. I mean, it was a national slogan. It was a rallying cry, really, a calling card for empire, if you want to look at it that way. The USS Maine was 6,682 tons. It was a second-class battleship. I'll explain that in a little bit. And it was commissioned in 1895. And it was the first U.S. Navy ship named for the state of Maine, which I think is pretty cool. There have been some others since, but this was the first. All right, so why did we need USS Maine at this time? Well, you can blame it on Latin America. At the time in the 1890s, Latin America was engaged in a arms buildup. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, they all found themselves in an arms race. And they started to buy modern armored warships from Europe, which freaked out the United States government when all these battleships started showing up for South American navies. I mean, Brazil's navy in the 1890s was the most powerful in the Americas. So it really caught the attention of US planners. So what did they do? Well, they commissioned, actually, they set up a contest, a design contest. They wanted 2 major warships built. Okay, and this contest was going to be open to any naval architect out there. So you could submit a design. They wanted an armored cruiser that was going to be called the USS Maine, and they wanted a battleship that is eventually going to be called the USS Texas. Now, a British firm won the Texas contract. A lot of irony there, a British firm building an American battleship, but I think that might have explained why they went with an American design for the Maine. In fact, it was an American, Theodore Wilson, who won the design contest for the USS Maine. Now, he used the latest ship design ideas of the day. I mean, USS Maine would have 2 gun turrets, but they're in echelon. So that means they're staggered. They're not on the center line of the ship. That's like the cutting edge idea of the day. Problem was, it didn't work. If you're echelon, you can't get your guns pointing totally forward, and you can't point them totally off the stern either. In fact, if we go back a shot to the beginning, you see the 2 guns pointing forward. You can't shoot more than maybe 20 degrees off your bow. Okay, so that was kind of a problem right off the bat. But he was using the latest technology of the day, thought it was a great idea, and they kind of went with it. I mean, there were 4 10-inch 30 caliber guns. They're firing 510-pound shells at a maximum elevation of 20,000 yards. I mean, that's over 11 miles. That'd be like, we could shell Belfast from here, that sort of thing. But drawbacks included a restriction of the field of fire, like I was just telling you about. And the gun ports are low enough on the water line that they got washed out during heavy seas. Very difficult for the men to get in there and to fire the guns. So some technical drawbacks right off the bat, although his design won and they ended up building it that way. Another big flaw was a lack of decent topside armor. Okay, now that was to counter the effects of rapid fire, intermediate caliber guns and high explosive shells coming down onto the ship. Okay, so it didn't have decent topside armor. And then another problem was they ended up using nickel steel armor. Now that sounds pretty good, but it wasn't the Harvey steel of the day or the Krupp armor you may be familiar with, the German better type of steel. The problem using nickel steel armor is that it's heavier and it's not as good. So it made Maine heavier and slower. In fact, the Maine is going to fail its contracted speed of 17 knots or 20 miles per hour. Not going to make it in its trials. So here it is in dry dock. Now, Wilson's original design for the thing had 3 masts in bark rigged for wind propulsion. They still thought they might need sails in this day and age, which I thought was kind of interesting. But this proved wicked impractical. I mean, the mizzen mast was removed right after launching, and then the remaining 2 masts were with the ship all the way to the end, but they were never used for sails. They never hoisted any sails whatsoever. In fact, they're going to get recovered, and they're going to go to some places here later on that I'll tell you about. The engine, they were, again, cutting edge at the time. They were 2 vertical triple expansion steam engines. They were inverted and mounted in watertight compartments, separated by a ship-long bulkhead. Okay, so if one side were to flood, you could still have power in the other, so forth. It was designed for a total output of 9,200 horsepower. 8 single-engine Scotch Marine boilers gave the steam to power those at 135 pounds per square inch working pressure. And they had to get the temperature of the water up to 364 degrees. So it's launched. first off, it was built in New York. I mean, the Brooklyn Navy Yard. A lot of people think, oh, the USS Maine was built in Maine. No, it wasn't. But it was launched November 18th, 1890. It was about 3 years behind schedule because of the steel, the nickel steel plating controversy, where they ended up going with the heavier, not as good stuff. The sponsor at the launching was Alice Tracy Wilmerding. Now, she's the granddaughter of the Navy Secretary at the time, Benjamin Tracy. Apparently, Alice, who wasn't very old, I think she was in her teens at the time, she struck the ship with the ceremonial bottle of champagne right at its plimsoll line depth of 13 feet. Okay. And I guess there was an audible like gasp from the old salts watching this, because I guess that's wicked unlucky for some reason. Hitting the plimsoll line with a bottle of champagne at the number 13, you know, as a result, a lot of people were like, nah, that ship, it's unlucky. Stay away, stay away. So that's the beginning of the USS Maine. Okay, not starting off all that great. It was finally commissioned, though, in September of 1895 under the command of Captain Aaron Crowninshield. And it was nice. I mean, it was a well-built ship. They put it through its paces. It didn't make its top speed, which that disgruntled a lot of the Navy people. 2 months after commissioning, it sailed into Newport, Rhode Island, to fit out and test fire its torpedoes. Later that month, they visited Portland and Bar Harbor up in Maine. It's the only time the ship came up to the state. And here you see a picture of it in Portland Harbor in 1897, all decked out with its flags, and you know, brand new battleship, pride of the state of Maine, and so forth. And here they are in Portland Harbor. Or excuse me, this is at Bar Harbor. The view looking forward on deck on the port side. It was in the summer, in Bar Harbor in the summer, kind of a nice time, as we all know. So that was a big deal. The newspapers of the state, you know, really played it up about the USS Maine visiting the state. Here's another shot of it in Bar Harbor. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about the ship itself. Now, the crew consisted of about 355 men. There were 26 officers, 290 enlisted men, and 39 Marines. For the next 18 months, the ship pretty much operated out of Norfolk, Virginia, working alongside the Atlantic East Coast and the Caribbean. And on April 10th, 1897, Crowninshield was relieved of command, and it was passed on to Captain Charles Sigsbee. Okay. Now, during that time period, that 18 months, they found out that the ship really didn't do what it was supposed to do. The speeds weren't attainable. The armor was a problem. It just wasn't, it was built to kind of be a battleship, but it wasn't big enough and armored enough to protect itself. So it's not going to throw punches in a battleship battle. And it wasn't fast enough to be like a cruiser or a sea raider or something like that. So the two jobs it should have been able to do, it really couldn't do either of them. So Sigsbee takes over command in April of 1897. And here's some photos of the interior of the ship that I came upon. This one was published in Uncle Sam's Navy in 1898. And this is known as the Gunner's Gang. Okay, so they're in the torpedo room, and you know, they're the ones responsible for firing the shells and so forth, you know, from the ship. And then this one is titled Evening Amusements, where the main crew members, you know, are playing cards and reading in their berthing spaces. You know, totally staged, you can tell, but you know, it was to show life aboard ship and everything like that. So the Maine is up there, but like I said, for 18 months, it wasn't doing what really it was supposed to do. So what do you do with the Maine? Well, I don't know. I found this photo I thought was a very good one, passing underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. You know, that was published in 1898. After the vessel was destroyed, a lot of people remembered, oh, we took a photo of it, and suddenly, you know, all these photos came out. But like I said, the vessel lacked more protective armor and higher firepower to go up against any kind of battleship, and it didn't have the speed to be a raiding cruise. I mean, the two jobs it was built for. So as it entered its first year of service, you could say that the USS Maine was already considered obsolete for the naval tactics of the day, certainly, which kind of ironic. But as we know, its fame or how it's going to become known had nothing to do with its armor or with its speed, actually. And that was because of Cuba. Okay, we got problems down in Cuba during this time. A lot of it is the mistreatment of the Cubans by the Spanish who ruled the country. Now, why is that concerning to the United States? Well, other than, the humanitarian aspect, which is concerning enough, Cuba geographically is only 90 miles from Key West, Florida. So in our backyard as can be. And during the 1890s, we had a lot of US senators, here's Senator Proctor, go down to Cuba and report back saying, yeah, Spanish aren't very nice to the Cuban people down there. It kind of became a drumbeat in the press. And the press at this time engaged in what's known as yellow journalism. And yellow journalism is based on kind of like sensationalized, trying to drum up purchasing of the paper. So it's going to have, even more, grabbing type of headlines or lurid photos or, artwork or things like that. Here's a political cartoon at the time that, you could tell they're trying to get the point across that America is sleeping, while just across the water, you got the mean old Spanish, stomping on the poor Cubans. And that kind of becomes a drumbeat in the mid 1890s. Okay, so in January of 1898, the USS Maine is going to be sent to Havana Harbor. Okay, the question though is why? I mean, is it going to go in and start shooting or something or what? Well, this is where we get into a little bit of geopolitics here. Anybody recognize the president at the time here? Elected in 1896, William McKinley. He's president at the time. He was also the last president to have served in the American Civil War. He was the only one to begin his service as an enlisted man in the war and ended as a brevet major too. In fact, he fought at the Battle of Antietam, which you may know, the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. And his quote is, I have seen the dead piled up. I have no wish to see, another war. So he's president at the time. And you have the media with the drumbeat saying, hey, we need to do something about the Spanish in Cuba. So he's trying to hold, slow down this drumbeat for war, but he needs to do something. So what does he do? He sends a battleship down to flex the U.S. muscle, mostly to show the resolve of the United States. So the captain of the Maine, as I said, is Charles Lagerbom. He, is sent to Havana Harbor. Now, he's an interesting guy. He joined the Navy back in 1862 during the Civil War. He was a pioneering oceanographer and hydrographer in his own right, which I thought was pretty interesting. In fact, I found in doing research on him that he developed the Sigsbee sounding machine, which became a standard item for deep water oceanographic investigation. And it was used extensively for the next half century. So pretty cool, the Sigsbee sounding machine. Who knew, huh? So anyway, he's the captain of the ship, and it's on a, quote, goodwill tour of Havana Harbor. But it's basically to remind the Spanish, hey, cool your jets on mistreating the Cubans. So in 1898, he takes the USS Maine into Havana, Cuba. Again, to show American resolve. And it must have been a pretty impressive thing. I mean, it's a brand new battleship and it comes gliding into Havana Harbor. I mean, we got a great photo of it here as it's passing the old Moro Castle Fortress. It arrives January 25th. Okay, that's about 3 weeks before its destruction. I mean, I don't want to give the story away, but it's not going to end well here for the USS Maine. 3 weeks after it moored itself in the harbor, it blew up. On the night of February 15th, it exploded, killing 266 sailors, 2/3 of its crew, right off the bat. Most of the men were asleep in the forward part of the ship when the first blast occurred. Most eyewitness accounts said there were 2 distinct blasts. In the immediate aftermath, the city of Washington, nearby American merchant steamship, rendered what assistance it could. All right, so what does this mean, this explosion? Well, immediately, Commander James Forsyth, he's the commandant of Key West Naval Base, which was kind of the closest U.S. naval, port to the incident. He telegraphs the Secretary of the Navy, John Long, and he's asking permission to send warships in and to say, hey, we need to go in and kind of find out what's going on and so forth. Rumors are flying like crazy. And then, of course, the yellow journalists get involved. And who do you think they jump all over as a reason why the Maine explodes? They start blaming Spain. I mean, the sinking of the USS Maine, if you look at it in national terms, this is important nationwide. I mean, the act is considered equal in our consciousness, maybe to the siege of the Alamo or the firing on Fort Sumter. But it was definitely inflamed by the yellow journalists of the day. I mean, they went for the sensationalized news of this without much concern for accuracy. I'm glad the media doesn't do that today. And so, but it picked its boogeyman there and basically said, yes, we think the Spanish are behind it. Why else, on a goodwill mission and so forth. So a lot of things are kind of in play here. Joseph Pulitzer, you may recognize the name from the Pulitzer Prize. He owned one of the New York newspapers of the day. His paper covered details of the horrible explosion of the ship, the details of the dead and the maimed and the heartbreaking stories along those lines. While his competitor, William Randolph Hearst, and his paper focused on the enemy, maybe who set this bomb. And yes, they're calling it a bomb in their reports. They even offered a reward of $50,000 to anyone who could detect the perpetrator. I mean, the newspapers, the American public, we're all demanding answers right now. And of course, this is going to lead to the Spanish-American War. Congress declares war in April, and we have the Spanish-American War. Incidentally, the most popular of U.S. wars. And I'm not sure why, probably because it was very brief. It was less than 6 months long. In fact, the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, John Hay, he called it a splendid little war. You don't hear the word splendid and war too often used together. But it was basically the United States entry into the 20th century and as a global player. It led to our acquisition of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and as well as the removal of the Spanish from Cuba. I mean, we basically entered the stage on a global geopolitics at the time. And it also led to the political rise of Teddy Roosevelt, who's going to dominate the next couple decades as well. So that's the Spanish-American War. But let's get back to the Maine. I mean, what's its story there? I mean, we know it's a pile of rubble in Havana Harbor. We know there's still U.S. dead aboard. We know it didn't sink very deep. I mean, many of the paintings and photos of the day show the mast and most of it sticking up above water. Now, Sigsbee and his officers were exonerated by a court of inquiry. They said, nah, you didn't do anything wrong. I mean, it was the Spanish. Let's go beat on them. He went on to command the USS Brooklyn. And in June 1905, he sailed for Cherbourg, France, to bring back the remains of John Paul Jones, which I thought was an interesting little tidbit about his history. John Paul Jones was going to be interred at the United States Naval Academy. His grave is there to this day, and you can go visit it. Well, he went to get him in 1905. Sigsbee died in 1923, and he's going to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, where the rest of the Maine memorial is going to be. Now, the first inquiry into the disaster was by the Spanish. You got to look at it from their point of view. I mean, a ship blows up in their harbor under their watch. They want to get in and quickly, hopefully, point out it wasn't us. So their findings were that the explosion had been caused by a fire in the coal bunker of the Maine. The U.S. were very quick to say, no, that's not right. You're just lying because you're Spanish and, you did this. U.S. Captain William Sampson's inquiry came out a month later in March of 1898. And his report had two parts, both proceedings and findings. Now, there are broad gaps in both. There are a lot of inconsistencies. They're wicked boring to read. But the report basically concludes that the ship had been blown up by a mine and then had an internal explosion, hence the provocation for declaring war, which is what the US does in April. Okay, and we fight the war, and the war is over quickly. And, the US goes on to become a global player at this time. Meanwhile, the wreckage of the Maine is still sitting in Havana Harbor throughout the war and for the next decade or so too. This photo was taken in 1910. I mean, so not much happening with the ship at that point. You can note that the mainmast is still standing, nearly upright 12 years later. I mean, it's a wicked navigational hazard at the time. So there was a lot of local interest in raising it and, kind of moving it out of Havana Harbor. Well, that's going to be echoed by some Americans who want to know a little bit more about it, and they want maybe to salvage some things off it. So this is going to begin a 3-year salvage program, but also another investigation into its sinking. Okay, so in 1910, there was a lot of interest in returning the USS Maine dead sailors to the United States. And we'll talk about where they were first buried, which was in Cuba. So this other court of inquiry also got underway. This is known as the Vreeland Board. It was convened. They looked into the explosion. And again, this is maybe 15 years after the war. They concluded there'd been multiple blasts, but said that the first one they still think was an external explosion, which had then ignited the magazine. So they're sticking with the mine, torpedo, Spanish behind it, that sort of approach. By the way, in 1976, Admiral Hyman Rickover commissioned his own investigation into the Maine, and he concluded that the cause was not a mine at all. Now, the coal used aboard the ship was bituminous, which it's very soft coal. It's not the anthracite. And bituminous coal is known for releasing a gas, and it's called fire damp. It's been known to cause spontaneous explosions. But are we ready to admit that the Spanish were right and we were wrong? Because that was our whole justification for war. So there were a lot of politics in play. As a result, Rickover's findings didn't really get a lot of play, even in 1976, like 80 some years later. So back to the wreck. They're raising the wreck here in Havana Harbor. This photo was taken in December of 1910. You can start to see the beginnings of a cofferdam being built around the wreck. And what that does is it basically isolates the wreck, and then you start pumping the water out so that you can get to the wreck. Its mast is shown here. Workers are preparing the air cylinders, actually, to start removing the water out of the cofferdam. I mean, this was a long process. This is looking at the stern of the Maine in late 1911. You can see the caissons kind of being lined up. That's going to help create the cofferdam. The inset photo of the person is Colonel William Black. This photo was taken of him in 1916 during the war, but he led the effort to raise the vessel at this time. And it was a pretty good engineering feat to do something like this. Other investigations in 1998 for the centennial of the sinking of the Maine, the National Geographic Society looked into it. And I remember this, and I was thinking, oh yeah, National Geographic, they'll get to the bottom of it. After much fanfare, they came out and said, yeah, we're not sure. Don't really know, don't really want to take a stand, here, keep buying our magazine, that sort of thing. So they didn't, clear up much either. 2002, probably one of the best of the investigations was led by the Discovery Channel. And they did a great show on it. You can still find it. It's really good. They used photographic evidence, naval experts, archival information. And their findings were that the initial explosion was probably caused by a coal bunker fire. But again, is that the final word to it? Maybe, maybe not. So we still, to this day, it's a great debate. Now, the cofferdam took a long time for it to build around it. Here you see it in 1911. About halfway between the ship bow and stern, they built a concrete and wooden bulkhead to seal the after section. And then they cut away what was left of the forward portion. Holes were cut into the bottom of the after section through which like jets of water were pumped. So this is going to break the suction which holds the ship down into the mud. Okay, it's like the mud seals it down there. Once they broke that hold, then they were able to bring the ship up. Here you see caissons around forming the cofferdam. Salvagers found that Maine's original Worthington pumps, the pumps on the ship, were still operational. After nearly 14 years, they fired them up, and they were very instrumental in raising the ship. And here you see it, back up, June 30th, 1911, 13 years after it sank. Its main deck was once again exposed to air. Pretty cool. The wreck had been badly corroded, though. Its bow severely crumpled. So for the next 20 months, Army engineers, they dismantled the ship piece by piece. They found a bunch of things, which we'll talk about. And they took down what was left of the superstructure and the decks and so forth. Here is eventually it's going to get towed out of the harbor. It's being towed by the USS Osceola. This is in March of 1913. So for about, 18 to 20 months, they basically took the ship apart piece by piece. This is a great panoramic photo. Probably you can't see much on it, but right in the center is a big battleship, the USS North Carolina, which kind of oversaw the salvage, as well as a cruiser, the USS Birmingham on the far right. And in between them is the Osceola escorting the wreck of the Maine to its final resting place. So they took it out about, I don't know, maybe 3 miles from shore. At 5 p.m. local time, 100,000 people on the shores watching. They opened up the seacocks on the Maine, and the vessel sank in 20 minutes. Boom. This was while they were playing taps and a 21-gun salute from the North Carolina. So here you see it's being sunk at about 600 fathoms into the Atlantic on the 16th of March, 1913. That's the last view of it above surface. So a lot of people say, well, we'll never know for sure now because the evidence is way out there and so forth. But I don't know. I do know that they found it again in October of 2000. Ernesto Tapanes and Paulina Zaletsky and other crews from a group called the Exploramar team, they discovered it. It was pretty well preserved. It was broken up, but it was about 3 miles off the Cuban coast in about 1,150 meters, which is about 3,800 feet. They identified it by its doors and hatches, as well as its anchor chain, which I thought, that's pretty interesting. The shape of its propellers also helped for them to say, yep, that's the Maine. It was surrounded by a debris field of coal. A lot of its coal had spilled out. The hull sits capsized on its port side, deeply buried in the mud, halfway up to its starboard propeller. So kind of a cool that it was still found. All right, so we're back after the explosion. What's going on? Well, first off, this is Fitzhugh Lee. He's the son of Robert E. Lee. Little interesting connection there. But he was the United States Consul General in Havana, Cuba at the time of the explosion in February of 1898. So he organized the response to the explosion. He arranged for a funeral procession for the dead crewmen in the streets of Havana shortly after the disaster. Several critically injured crew members were quickly transported to Key West, Florida. But those who died stayed in Havana. Here you see the dead lying in state at City Hall in Havana, Cuba. And then they were buried in Cuba's Colon Cemetery. That's where many of them are first buried. This photo was taken in 1998, 100 years later. Now, some of those initial survivors who had been taken to Florida ended up dying of their wounds. And those men were buried in Key West. And so this is the another cemetery for the USS Maine people, Key West, Florida. 19 crewmen, several of them unidentified, were interred there under the statue of an American sailor, and he's holding a big oar. It's known as the U.S. Battleship Maine Monument, Key West Cemetery, Florida. It's a nice little place if you ever do get a chance to go to it. The move, though, began about, let's do something special with these guys. So let's bring them to our National Cemetery at Arlington. So after the Spanish-American War in December of 1899, the remains of many of the USS Maine guys were transferred from Havana to Arlington National Cemetery. Here you see a lot of wreaths used to decorate the coffins. It was called USS Maine's Last Muster. The remains of 163 were brought up from Havana and reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery. And you can see it today. It's a sectioned off area. Pretty interesting to walk through. The presidential dais was set up so that the memorial would be right around where the burials were. And all this was happening in December of 1899, right after the war. Now, on May 10th, 1910, Congress authorized funds for the removal of the wreck from Havana Harbor. That's when the whole Vreeland Commission was set up. At that same time, they started to talk about proper reinterment at Arlington for the Maine dead, including 70 bodies that they found in the wreckage still when they brought it up. These funds also paid for the removal and return of the ship's mast. So on October 6, 1910, the foremast was recovered, and eventually it was sent to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And it was set up on the grounds there in 1913. It's still there today. You can go see it there. Now, during the 1911 Vreeland Board inquiry, the remains of 66 men were found, but only one was positively identified. He was engineering officer Harry Keyes, and so they returned him to his hometown. But the rest were removed by the armored cruiser North Carolina for repatriation and eventual burial at Arlington. And this is a picture of the first USS Maine memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. This is before 1915, because they're going to do even more. You see some of the little side guns as well as one of its anchors. Eventually, the mainmast is going to go there as well. And this is where they're bringing it in. It's known as the Maine's Mainmast Memorial. President Woodrow Wilson was on hand on Memorial Day, 1915, to dedicate it. It had been removed during the Vreeland inquiry 5 years earlier. 165 crewmen from the USS Maine are buried at Arlington. Although the remains of one sailor was later exhumed and moved to his hometown in Indianapolis. Of the remaining, though, the identities of only 62 are positively known. And I find that pretty interesting. The other 200 or so, nobody was able to identify them. So they're all kind of like buried together, which maybe is perhaps fitting. Here you see the Mainmast Memorial fairly recently. And the ship's bell was found. Now, it was split in half by the explosion, but they mounted half of it on a door to the memorial there at Arlington, which I thought was pretty interesting. Now, in Cuba, there were some monuments. This is the Cuban Friendship Urn, also known as the Cuban-American Friendship Urn, or the USS Maine Memorial. Now, it once stood atop this marble column in Havana. It was a symbol of friendship and bond between Cuba and the US, but in October 1926, a hurricane blew over the whole thing, but the urn survived. Now, they rebuilt it because this photo was taken about 1930, but by the 1960s, as we all know, Cuba and America didn't get along very well. And as a result, the United States ended up taking the urn. It's now located in East Potomac Park in Washington, D.C. And I'm not sure if the rest of the marble column remains in Havana or not. I haven't been able to check that out yet. Probably the best known of the USS Maine memorials, though, is in Columbus Circle, New York City. It's located on the southwest corner of Central Park at the Merchants Gate, near the confluence of 59th Street 8th Avenue, Broadway, and Columbus Circle. It was completed in 1913, and at the top of its center pylon is a woman bronze figure called Columbia Triumphant, sculpted by artist Attilio Picarelli. Columbia rides in a seashell chariot drawn by 3 seahorses. It's a beautifully sculpted bronze sculpture. And the bronze itself was used from melted down Maine guns, which I thought was pretty interesting. Pretty impressive there. And on the side of it is this bronze plaque relief. And this became kind of like the memorial. They made many of these and distributed them throughout the United States. And I've been fortunate to come upon a couple of them. In fact, one here in Camden. I mean, this is the War Memorial Post 30, American Legion. And there's the plaque right between us that you see. Now, some other things I found that they brought back was the Maine silver, from the officers' mess. It was given to the ship in 1895 when it was commissioned, and it was recovered during the Vreeland, inquiry. The silver serving dishes, you can see that they're worked in a pine cone and pine needle design. Where is it today? It's at the Blaine House over in Augusta, in the state dining room, and they've been there since 1922. A 6-inch gun recovered from the Maine is down at Fort Allen Park on Portland's Eastern Promenade. Drive down there, check it out. It's basically taking aim at Peaks Island. Now, there's also supposed to be a recovered US Maine projectile somewhere in Lewiston. I'm still trying to hunt that one down. I haven't been able to locate that one yet. But the best known one here, probably in Maine, is the scroll work from the bow of the ship. That was recovered. It's now a memorial in Davenport Park, Bangor. The interesting thing is this memorial almost didn't happen. The mayor of Bangor at the time, Flavius Beale, and Congressman Frank Guernsey, they got the city to accept it, donated after the salvage operations. A committee was formed in 1917 to do something about it, identify a location, decide on a design, but nothing happened and the project languished. Until 1920, when they found that a city employee had sold it, the relics for scrap. They quickly, got it back, and Bangor was able to recover them. And then they vowed to renew the action, and Davenport Park was created. That's near the corner of Main and Cedar Streets. A local architect, Edwin Kent, produced the design. It cost $5,300 and was dedicated in 1922. The last surviving officer of the USS Maine was Watt Tyler Cluvius, Jr. He'd been an 1896 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, so he was fresh out of school, and he joined the Maine the following year. He was on board at the time of the explosion. He later became an admiral, and when he retired from the Navy, he was president of Worcester Polytechnic Institute. He died in 1952. And then the very last sailor from the Maine was George Fox, who was 19 years old at the time of the explosion. And he always believed it was the Spanish. He said, to my dying day, I will know that it was a Spanish pilot had moored the ship over a mine. He'd been in his bunk when there was the double explosion and received a pretty nasty head wound in the blast. He was the last living survivor. He was 86 years old when he died in December of 1964. He's buried in Wisconsin. So I hope now when people say, remember the Maine, you'll be able to help them out with a few little tidbits about it. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, why was it named after the state of Maine?
I think it was part of the national program. I'm not sure why they picked Maine. I mean, Texas was a big congressional player at the time, but at the in the 1890s, Maine was still a pretty powerful state. they were even more powerful before the Civil War with, many political connections like Blaine and people like that. But I think they had enough sway to have a ship named after the state.
Could have been Robert E. Lee's son's doing to have it named the Maine because of the bad blood.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know Fitzhugh didn't have much to do with the ship until it blew up, in his backyard there at Cuba. I mean, he was kind of the ambassador there at the time.
So the
Yeah. Yes.
Why were the crew up in the explosion buried in Havana? Was that military protocol? Why wouldn't they have been brought back?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they interred them pretty quickly because of the nastiness of the explosion. As I said, most were not identifiable. I think it might have been, kind of a mass type of burial because of pieces as opposed to, bodies and stuff. And so I think they wanted to, and it was tropical, practicality, yeah. And I think the Cubans were okay with it too, because they weren't too thrilled about, losing Americans there. I mean, they looked at them as kind of allies against the Spanish.
even Lincoln's body up north was moved 4 times.
Yeah, that's right. They even got stolen once.
Terrible.
Yeah.
See if anyone on Zoom has any questions. Those illustrations are very dramatic, telling the explosion.
Yeah, yeah. That I think it was the magazine explosion is what really tore the ship apart. But the scroll at Davenport Park, if you ever get a chance, check it out. Next time you're driving that, it's right there. Now, I know we've all been by it so many times, but they do a nice job of keeping it, polished up. Let me see. Yeah, I
It
mean,
wasn't damaged. Is there any commentary about why that got sold out from underneath Bangor almost?
no, I think it was just a local Bangor employee said, "Hey, this thing, nobody's said anything about it for the last couple of years. I'd probably get some bucks." I mean, because it's kind of, there's some bronze and there's some this involved, and
But that's like saying the government is impotent for someone to be able to.
no, I can't say that. It's. I think it was just it was a.
It's about territories north of Bangor and Lumber, where it was totally wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think here it was just more inefficiency that they kind of forgot they had it, or they meant to do something with it, but it just never kind of materialized until that happened, and then it's like, oh geez, we better do something with this, and so
Nobody took it as
that's what came out.
positive.
No. And check out the gun down in Portland Harbor too. Yeah.
So we know Roosevelt became crazy famous
Yeah.
after this event, but what was his next move in this?
With Teddy Roosevelt, well, he led his guys up, the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill and became a hero. And everybody just loved his enthusiasm. He had been the Assistant Secretary of Navy. In fact, he told Admiral Dewey right after the Maine blew up, he cabled him. Dewey was in charge of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet in Hong Kong, and said, "Hey, get to the Philippines as quick as you can, because we're probably going to have a war." And so Dewey sailed into Manila Bay, blasted the Spanish ships there. Half of them didn't even know they were at war yet. And it was a huge victory for America. And hundreds of Spanish were killed. Not one American was killed. One of the worst of the injuries was the guy running to Dewey to tell him they had won, and he fell and broke his leg. And I mean, it was a resounding first, and you got to look at it from the United States. It was like a young upstart country landed the first good punch in the war, and that's why I think a lot of Americans remember it fairly fondly as a splendid little war. We won big, we won quick, and hey, we won. Was there a question back there? No? Okay.
So while the Maine was in Havana Harbor, what was its plan? How long was it gonna stay there? And what were they?
Good question. I mean, 3 weeks is quite a long time to just kind of show the American flag. I don't know if there were talks going on. I know it caught the attention of the Spanish. They protested the arrival of the Americans, but you know, again, the explosion kind of took all that right off the front page, and it was all about Spanish treachery at that point on.
Do you know if it was parked in one spot that whole 3 week time?
My understanding is that it was, yes.
So that means unlikely that it was parked on top of a mine where low tide would bring it down and hit the mine.
Right.
It would have hit it much before 3 weeks.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the tides are like in Havana Harbor. You know, it's interesting that Fox kind of believed that, you know, to this day, that the
If they
The
moved it
pilot
around,
brought it right
then
over.
it might be possible, his theory.
Yeah, it's a good mystery.
Do you think that there will be any more investigations?
I'd like to think that there's still, you know, people can look at this. I would love to see, you know, more footage of the ship at 3,000 feet, just to determine, you know, what was explosions mostly outward or inward, or, you know, things like that. There might be some more things you could do. I mean, technology gets better and better. You know, so yeah, I'd like to think we could maybe solve this at some point.
They tow it out, what, didn't it have holes in the hull?
It did, but they plugged them all up. You know, in fact, they punched holes in it to use jets to force the water out, and then they plugged them up, and then they pumped air, and it was enough to break the seal and get it to the surface. And then it was just a matter of hauling it out. And if you noticed on some of the photos, there were a lot of flotation devices around it still, just to keep it above the water until you got it where you wanted, and then let it go. Like I said, it went down in 20 minutes, which that's pretty quick.
Did they pick a specific spot, or was it just like?
No, I think they wanted to get out far enough so that it was out of the shipping lanes and things like that. But they also didn't want to go too far because they had 100,000 people on the shore, you know, watching, you know, and then they just let it go.
The device that the captain invented to check depth,
Yeah.
is that dropping something and then checking it as it went past it?
Yeah, that was more for like water current trawls, you know, maybe taking temperatures at depth and so forth. It was basically to get an actual scientific package deep enough, you know, not taking temperature readings the whole way, but suddenly taking them there at that depth. That's what was pretty cool about it. And then he rigged up enough systems so that it, you know, you're talking, you know, several thousands of feet depth, which is a pretty big operation because you have to have a coil of wire
So
and then drums and stuff.
What would be stopped when they did it? You don't know.
I'm not sure. These I think were trawlable, meaning, you know, you're moving while you do that. But others are, you could just, you know, sink to take what you need right at that spot.
Moving. And
No.
if it passed, they would pull it up and get an exact reading.
Yeah, I mean, there were all kinds of ideas. That's the beauty of early oceanography, you know, people coming up with ideas like that.
They probably used that to figure out how deep the water they wanted to sink it in.
Yeah, he was well known for his oceanography. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
You mentioned that there were masts and they thought that maybe they would raise sails, but never did.
Yeah.
Were there other battleships at the time that did raise sails?
No, in fact, if you notice other battleships at this time, they didn't have masts at all, really.
Alright.
If they did, it was more for, you know, their radio wires or their pennants and flags and stuff, but it wasn't, you know, the idea of the mast is, you know, no longer for sail, but more, like I said, for other reasons, you know, put your radar up or things like that. That's a good evolution of it. So that's why I thought was pretty interesting. I mean, the ship, like I said, was kind of obsolete the day it was launched. The mast, you know, was another feature of that obsolescence.
So for cargo shipping, steamboats hadn't completely replaced square riggers.
No, square riggers are going to remain fairly useful until World War I, and then into the 20s, even used in, you know, backwater areas for
They were still
coal barges and stuff. Faster, I don't know. They were cheaper to power and use, although you had to pay your humans, you know, to raise and lower the sails. But
You know, steamboats at that time, but
no, it wasn't so much speed, it was more the regularity of the service, that you could be there in 7 days or, you know, something like that. That's what they came to rely on more so. Well, like a weekly sailing schedule and stuff like that. It really kind of regulated, kind of like what happened to the railroad industry on the
I
mainland.
know that wooden boat, the Red Jacket, still holds the record for a wooden boat across the Atlantic for 13 days.
Right, right. Yeah, it also holds some records getting around Cape Horn. Yeah, Rockland built. Well, thank you very much.
Do you have
Yeah,
any questions?
appreciate
for
it.
me?